would be a good idea for us to at least give a broad overview or definition of what heart rate variability is. So there's your softball, Marco. What is heart rate variability? And then why, like, what is it telling us, especially like in relation to sports performance and recovery?
Yeah. So heart rate variability is a measure of physiological stress. I think that's the way we should look at it almost independently of the application of interest. This is why, because let's say that the way the heart rate is modulated is mostly driven by, first, its intrinsic firing rate, which is about 100 beats per minute. And that is fairly constant, actually. There is not any variability at that stage. And then, as you know, when you measure your heart rate is not typically 100 beats per minute at rest. That's because of the influence of the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is modulating heart rate in a way that typically means that at rest, there is a large influence from one branch of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic, which means that your heart rate is much lower. And this influence reduces heart rate and increases variability, because basically parasympathetic activity is modulating heart rhythm with breathing rate as well. So everything is interconnected in a way that, for example, parasympathetic activity is higher when you exhale, it's a bit lower when you inhale. That's why we create this modulation in consecutive heartbeats, which we measure with HRV, and not only with heart rate, which is just an average and still informative in a way of the state of the body, but less sensitive to these changes that are captured very well by HRV and that are reflective of physiological stress. So when we measure these processes, we simply measure, we have a proxy to what is autonomic activity, and in particular, I would say activity of the parasympathetic nervous system, so that we can understand what is the level of stress on the body. And this is something that we need to understand also needs to be contextualized always, right? We cannot take an HRV measurement and, if we take an HRV measurement, we don't know anything basically about the state of this person, right? We always needed to compare it to
let me
something.
make a quick comment there, Marco, because that is such a valuable point, right? I think that one of the biggest misconceptions that people have in detecting and capturing this data is that they believe that they can kind of just use it for what it is right then and there without providing any level of context for that data point. And it's like, that's kind of just like useless right now. It's like, what are we actually like comparing to this to? And so I wanted to kind of like really emphasize that point, because people really have a hard time understanding that, that this is not just some number that we can take at any time or any point in day and just look singular, like that number singularly. So I just wanted to pause real quick to make sure that I fully emphasize that, but carry on.
Yeah, exactly. That's so important because, it's the same as we were saying before about the absolute values and comparing with others. You take a measurement here, you might want to compare to someone. Your score is lower, which means lower variability, which means higher stress. Does that mean anything? Because it's lower than your friend. And, that doesn't mean anything, actually. So that's not how we use this data. It's always important to contextualize it, which typically means to compare to your own data collected previously. So this kind of comparison will allow you to understand when there are periods of higher or lower stress. And there is another point that is really important, going back to the spot checks, is that due to the nature of what we are trying to measure here, autonomic activity, and the fact that the autonomic nervous system is constantly changing to respond to anything you do, from light activity to eating or drinking, or again, just having coffee or talking or being psychologically stressed, or even just the day and night, the circadian rhythm, and anything affects your physiology. So this is why measuring sporadically here and there is not informative either, even if you compare to your own data, because so many factors have an effect that you might not be able to actually understand if there is something that is, let's say, a significant change, something important to understand, so that you can act on that information, or if it is just the normal variability that is happening because of a series of other stressors, transitory or not. And that's why these spot checks need to be part of what we call, for example, the morning routine, where
Mm-hmm.
you measure, first thing in the morning before you are impacted by all these other stressors. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that is repeatable every day and allows you to get this baseline assessment of your physiological stress, and then to compare to that and to understand when there is higher or lower stress and to make changes, while that is not really the case outside of this specific context, if we want to assess baseline
Right.
physiological stress.
Yeah, I know that you have really focused, throughout your work on this idea of doing the spot check first thing in the morning, kind of as a part of the morning routine. I saw a really interesting study that you posted, so I kind of know your answer to this, but people may not realize, your answer to this. So I'm going to ask you anyway. A lot of people have these wearables that are measuring, or so-called measuring, heart rate variability overnight. Now, some are doing it continuous, some are doing it at random times, some kind of are doing their proprietary readings or wherever it may be. Is there any reason why somebody should be doing a morning check over a continuous night check, or is a continuous night check better? Or what's your take on that? What does the research have to say about continuous overnight HRV compared to morning HRV?
Yeah, so I think that first thing, it's great that we have so many different ways now to capture this data, right? Just a few years back, we had almost nothing that you could use that was
Right.
not, cumbersome or difficult to use or expensive or things like that. Now we have just phones that we can use for spot checks. We have wearables that we can wear and they measure as we sleep. They are optical, so rings or wristbands or anything like that. It's extremely comfortable to use. You don't have to, put a strap on or gel
Yeah.
electrodes and things like that, like ECGs. So that allows us to collect much better data. And even though optical measurements tend to be a bit noisy when there is movement. Like we know that during exercise, if we use a watch, for example, for heart rate, we notice often it doesn't work very well and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, at rest, when there is minimal movement or during the night, these devices can work very well. So they can certainly provide high quality HRV data. And that has been shown in different papers that have validated some of these devices, like the Oura Ring. You can see that
Mm-hmm.
the data is accurate. So that's a great starting point. Another important point there is that the devices that measure during the night, unfortunately, they don't always do it in the same way. And
Yeah.
some ways are better than others. So that's a bit of a problem sometimes, in particular, some devices like the Apple Watch, which
Mm-hmm.
can measure HRV accurately, has some issues when measuring HRV automatically because it
Yeah.
does not do it continuously. It just gives
Does it do
you
like
a
five
few.
minute increments?
Yeah, it does it for a few minutes, but then it would give you a point maybe at 1 a.m. and one at 3 a.m. and one at 5
Oh,
a.m.
okay.
Just a couple of data points, right?
Sure, sure.
Let's say 3 or 4 data points per night. That's unfortunately is a bit problematic because these data points, can be a bit noisy, can be impacted by the circadian rhythm, by different sleep stages in which you might be at that hour, because every night you will be in a different sleep stage, as those have, a different, they're not the same at every hour, every night, right?
Right.
It's just depending
Right.
on the cycle of sleep. So those are all issues that make the data less reliable during the night if you have just a few sporadic data points. If you
Sure.
have the whole night, then it's totally fine because you can average out these issues basically just by using the average of the night as it is reported by other tools. Um, so this can be used provided that they provide you with all the data or an
Sure.
average of
Yeah.
this night. And then,
Mhm.
in the context of using this or the morning measurement, I think both of them are valid. There is actually this nice paper from just last week showing that across a range of values and people, the measurements in the morning and the measurements during the night were basically equivalent. There was no difference
Mhm.
in these two methods. So